In 1961, a group of preschoolers were led one by one into a room containing toys, crayons, and a 5-foot inflatable clown. Nobody told them what to do, nobody told them how to feel. They simply watched an adult in the room for less than 10 minutes. And what happened next would go on to explain school shootings, domestic abuse cycles, gang recruitment, and the reason your child just called their sibling something they definitely did not learn from you. The adult in the room walked up to that inflatable clown. Researchers called it the Bobo Doll, and did something strange. She punched it in the face. She sat on it. She hit it with a mallet, kicked it across the floor, and shouted things at it. Things like, "Sock him in the nose," and "hit him down." Then she left. A few minutes later, each child was told they couldn't play with the good toys anymore. It was a setup designed to frustrate them, to make them just a little bit angry. Then they were led into a room with ordinary toys and a Bobo doll of their own. What the children did next would become one of the most replicated, most cited, and most misunderstood experiments in the history of psychology. Because most people think they already know what happened. They don't, not really. And by the end of this, you'll understand why a single afternoon in a Stanford lab quietly rewired how we think about violence, parenting, media, and free will itself. The man behind the clown was Albert Bandura, a psychologist who had grown suspicious of the two dominant theories of his time. One camp, the Freudians, believed aggression bubbled up from some internal reservoir of instinct, something you were born with, something that needed to be released like steam from a valve. The other camp, the behaviorists, believed people only repeated actions that were directly rewarded or punished. Neither theory could explain something Bandura kept noticing in real life. Children who had never been hit, never been rewarded for hitting, and never experienced any personal frustration would still, somehow, pick up a fistfight technique they'd only ever seen once, on television, in a comic book, on a playground watching from the sidelines. Bandura had a radical idea. What if you didn't need to be punished or rewarded at all? What if you could learn violence exactly the same way you learn to tie your shoes or hold a fork, just by watching someone else do it? This idea sounds obvious now. In 1961, it was heresy. So Bandura designed an experiment so simple a child could pass through it without ever suspecting they were the subject. 72 children, ages 3 to 6, from the Stanford University nursery school. Some watched an adult calmly play with the Bobo doll, ignoring it entirely. Others watched an adult attack it, the punches, the mallet, the specific and almost theatrical cruelty. A third group saw no adult model at all. Then, one by one, each child was mildly frustrated and placed alone with a room full of toys, including a Bobo doll of their own. Here is where the results stop being a footnote in a textbook and start becoming something closer to a warning. The children who had watched the aggressive adult didn't just become more aggressive in general. They reproduced the exact behaviors they had seen. The same punches, the same phrases. Some children even used the mallet in precisely the same striking motion. This wasn't generalized anger finding an outlet. This was imitation down to the gesture. And it got stranger. Boys who watched a male model behave aggressively were more aggressive than boys who watched a female model do the identical thing. Girls showed a smaller version of the same pattern. Something in these 3- and 4-year-olds was already tracking who was allowed to be violent, based on nothing more than the gender of the person they'd watched for 10 minutes. But the detail that unsettles psychologists most, even 60 years later, is this. Some children invented new forms of aggression that weren't in the original demonstration at all. They had watched one specific kind of violence and extracted something more abstract from it, a general permission, a rule that said, in effect, this is now a place where hitting is an option. This is the moment Bandura's theory stopped being a hypothesis and became a framework that would eventually be called social learning theory, later refined into social cognitive theory. And its central claim was almost uncomfortably simple. Humans do not need to personally experience a reward or punishment to learn a behavior. We can learn entirely by watching someone else experience the consequences we never had to personally endure. Bandura called this vicarious reinforcement, and it explains something that had puzzled psychologists for decades: why children raised in violent homes often grow up to replicate that violence, even when they swore, as children, that they never would. But here's where the story takes its first real turn, because Bandura wasn't finished. He ran a second version of the experiment, and this second version is the part almost nobody remembers, even though it might be the more important half. In this version, children watched the same aggressive adult model, but this time they also saw what happened to that adult afterward. One group watched the aggressive adult get rewarded, praised, given candy and soda for the display of violence. A second group watched the same adult get scolded and punished. A third group saw no consequence delivered at all. If Bandura's theory was only about imitation, all three groups should have behaved identically. They'd all watched the same violent act, but they didn't. Children who saw the model punished were noticeably less aggressive afterward than children who saw the model rewarded or saw no consequence at all. This is the detail that changes everything, because it means children weren't just copying actions, they were running a kind of silent cost-benefit calculation based entirely on someone else's experience. Bandura called this vicarious reinforcement, and it revealed something profound about the human mind that we still underestimate today. We are constantly building a private rule book of what is safe, rewarded, and permitted, and we're building most of that rule book by watching other people live out the consequences we never had to personally endure. And then came the twist that even Bandura didn't fully anticipate. When the researchers later offered every child a reward, stickers and juice, to actually perform the aggressive acts they'd watched, something extraordinary happened. The differences between the groups nearly vanished. The children who'd seen the model punished and therefore had appeared less aggressive suddenly demonstrated that they had learned the exact same behaviors as everyone else. They simply hadn't been performing them. This distinction between learning and performing is arguably Bandura's most important and most overlooked discovery. A child or an adult can absorb a behavior completely, store it with total precision, and never once display it, because the incentives aren't right. The behavior sits there, dormant, like a program installed but not yet run.
Think about what this means outside the lab. A teenager who was never shown a hint of aggression may have already absorbed in complete detail exactly how to behave violently. From a father's temper, a violent video game, a movie, a group chat, and simply never encountered the circumstances that would make performing it feel worthwhile. The moment those circumstances change, a betrayal, a provocation, a crowd that rewards it, the behavior doesn't need to be learned. It's already there, waiting. This is why the Bobo Doll Experiment quietly became one of the most cited justifications in debates over media violence, decades before anyone had heard of a video game controller. If children can learn aggression from watching a single adult for 10 minutes, what happens after thousands of hours of televised violence? Bandura's research became foundational to the American Psychological Association's early warnings about television, and later to research on violent video games conducted by psychologists like Craig Anderson. The findings there were more modest than the panic suggested. Media violence tends to correlate with modest increases in aggressive thoughts and minor aggressive behavior, not with the dramatic real-world violence that headlines implied. But the underlying mechanism Bandura identified, that we learn behavior by observing models and that we calibrate our willingness to perform it based on the consequences we see others receive, has held up remarkably well. And this is where the story usually stops in most retellings, but there's a deeper layer,
one that connects the Bobo doll not just to childhood, but to some of the darkest chapters of adult behavior ever studied. A year before Bandura published his most famous Bobo doll results, a young psychologist named Stanley Milgram was designing an experiment about obedience to authority, in part inspired by trying to understand how ordinary German citizens had participated in the Holocaust. Milgram found that most people would deliver what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to a stranger simply because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required it. For years, these two experiments, Bandura's and Milgram's, were treated as separate stories about separate topics, one about children learning violence, one about adults obeying authority. But look at them side by side and a single thread runs through both. In both experiments, ordinary, psychologically healthy people did something they would never have predicted themselves capable of, not because of some internal violent instinct, but because of what they observed modeled around them and what they believed the consequences would be. The child watching an adult attack a doll and the adult watching an authority figure calmly insist the experiment requires that you continue were responding to the same underlying mechanism. Humans constantly scan their environment for cues about what behavior is permitted, rewarded, and safe, and they adjust their own behavior accordingly, often without any conscious deliberation at all. This is also, unsettlingly, the psychological engine behind cult recruitment and radicalization. Investigators who studied groups like Jonestown or modern extremist recruitment pipelines have repeatedly found the same pattern Bandura documented in miniature. New members don't suddenly develop violent or extreme beliefs from nothing. They watch trusted models perform behaviors, watch those behaviors get rewarded with approval, belonging, or status within the group, and gradually absorb a widening sense of what's permitted, the exact vicarious reinforcement loop that a room full of 4-year-olds demonstrated with an inflatable clown. It even shows up somewhere far more mundane than a cult or a war crime. It shows up in your own workplace. Psychologists studying organizational behavior have found that new employees calibrate their ethics largely by watching what happens to their colleagues, not by reading the employee handbook. If they watch a coworker cut corners and get promoted, that's a Bobo doll moment. If they watch someone get quietly punished for the same shortcut, that's a Bobo doll moment too. Nobody sits an employee down and teaches them where the real ethical line is. They learn it exactly the way those Stanford preschoolers learned where the line on violence was, by watching what happened to somebody else. There's an uncomfortable implication buried in all of this, one that Bandura himself spent the rest of his career exploring. If behavior is shaped this powerfully by observation and modeled consequence, then free will, in the way most people imagine it, is far less absolute than it feels from the inside. You likely believe your reactions, your temper, your instinctive responses to conflict are simply who you are. But Bandura's research suggests a good portion of that instinctive response was assembled piece by piece from every model of behavior you were ever exposed to and every consequence you ever watched somebody else receive for it, long before you were old enough to evaluate any of it critically. This didn't sit well with Bandura either. In his later work, he pushed back against the idea that we're purely passive recorders of our environment, and this pushback produced perhaps his most important concept, reciprocal determinism, and its companion idea, self-efficacy. Bandura argued that while environment shapes behavior, behavior also shapes environment, and, crucially, our belief in our own capability to act differently can override the models we were given. A child who watched violence modeled is not doomed to reproduce it forever. The same observational machinery that installs a behavior can install a different one if different models and different consequences enter the picture. This is, in fact, the entire theoretical foundation behind modern intervention programs for at-risk youth, programs that deliberately expose children to positive models being rewarded for conflict resolution, essentially running Bandura's experiment in reverse, on purpose, as therapy. Which brings us back to that room in 1961 and why it still matters on an ordinary Tuesday in your own life. because you are still, right now, somebody's Bobo Doll experiment. Every time you argue in front of your children rather than in private, every time a friend watches you handle an insult with silence instead of retaliation, every time a coworker watches how you respond to being wronged, you are the adult in the room with the mallet, whether you intended to be or not. Somebody is building their private rule book off what you do next and off what happens to you afterwards, whether or not either of you ever notice it happening. That's the part of this story that should genuinely stay with you. Not that children learn violence from violence. That much, by now, feels almost obvious. It's that none of us are exempt from being the model. Every room you walk into, someone is quietly deciding what's permitted based on what they see you get away with, get rewarded for, or get punished for. We like to imagine our character as something fixed and internal, entirely our own creation. Bandura's inflatable clown suggests otherwise. It suggests we are all, at every age, still watching each other, still calculating consequences we never personally faced, still deciding what kind of person it's safe to become. If understanding the hidden psychology behind everyday behavior changes the way you see the people around you, consider subscribing. There are many more invisible forces shaping our decisions than most of us ever realize, and the Bobo doll was only the beginning.